Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Picture this. It's January 2024. You're working retail, but today you are not clocking into your local mall.
Definitely not. You are way off your normal beat.
Right. Instead, you've been summoned to Cupertino, California, Apple's corporate headquarters. But this isn't like a standard corporate retreat. You walk in, and you are immediately handed a non-disclosure agreement.
You have to sign it right there, swearing absolute secrecy.
Yeah, and not just about what you're about to see, but even about the specific building you're standing in. And then security hands you a Faraday bag.
Which is so intense. I mean, for those who don't know, that's a specialized pouch lined with metal mesh. It completely blocks all cellular, Wi-Fi, and GPS signals.
Wow.
Yeah, you drop your phone in, and you are entirely cut off from the outside world.
It feels like you're in a Tom Clancy novel, right? Like you're about to be briefed on a covert operation, but you aren't a spy. You're an Apple Store employee.
Exactly. Just a regular retail worker.
And all of this intense James Bond-level security is just to introduce you to the Vision Pro headset. Management was so terrified of leaks that they even forbade employees who had finished their training from speaking to the ones waiting in the lobby.
Right, because they wanted to tightly control that initial sense of wonder. They were basically manufacturing an emotional experience for their own staff.
Oh, for sure. Trying to induce this pure moment of technological magic. And according to the sources we're looking at today, I mean, it actually worked.
It really did. The initial romance was incredibly potent.
Yeah, you have everyday retail employees putting on this mixed reality headset, and they're instantly transported to, like, high-definition moonscapes.
Whoa.
Or they're watching movies on these massive, crisp, virtual cinema screens.
There's actually a great quote from a longtime employee in Columbus, Ohio, Megan Lee.
Oh, right, yeah. She came back from this Cupertino training and said, it was genuinely the coolest expletive thing I've ever seen. She called it insanely brilliant.
And that reaction right there, that is the absolute peak of the mountain.
Yeah.
It's the exact sentiment Apple wanted those employees to bring back to their home stores.
But the crash back down to earth was unprecedented. So, okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into excerpts from Noam Scheiber's 2026 book, Mutiny. And we're looking at a massive, almost unbelievable paradox.
It really is a paradox.
Right. We have a product launch that begins with airtight secrecy, hundreds of millions of dollars in research, and just absolute jaw-dropping awe from the staff. And yet, it ends up as a retail fiasco where flagship stores are literally selling 0 units a week.
Well, what's fascinating here is that if we only look at the headset itself, we miss the actual narrative.
Wait, what do you mean?
I mean, this isn't just a story about a clunky, expensive piece of hardware missing the mark. This is fundamentally a story about a 25-year cultural shift.
Okay, that makes sense.
The failure of the Vision Pro at the retail level is actually a symptom of the slow, methodical decay of Apple's entire retail philosophy. Basically, we're watching the triumph of logistics over evangelism.
Man, that is a massive paradigm shift for a company whose stores are widely considered the gold standard of retail. So, if the product was so mind-blowing in that controlled environment in Cupertino, how did it lose all its magic on the flight back to the local mall?
That's the big question.
Obviously, the price is a huge factor, right? I mean, a $3,500 base price tag, which inches closer to $4,000 once you add prescription lens inserts and a travel case, that's a giant barrier. But the fiction started before the customer ever looked at the price tag.
Exactly. The friction started with the physics of the device itself, which then collided pretty violently with the reality of the store floor.
Yeah.
First, you have the physical burden. The Vision Pro weighs about 1.5 pounds.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but...
Right, it doesn't sound like much in your hands. But strap 1.5 pounds to your face for a 3-hour work session.
Yeah.
And your neck muscles are going to be screaming.
Not to mention the software limitations at launch. I mean, it lacked a robust app ecosystem compared to the iPhone or iPad. And for a device supposedly built for the future of work, it was notoriously awkward for video calls.
Oh, video calls, yeah.
Because it covers your eyes, it can't just use a front-facing camera like a laptop. It has to generate a digital avatar of what Apple called a persona. And users widely describe these personas as looking zombie-like.
Yeah, they fell deep into the uncanny valley.
Which is just so creepy.
It is. For anyone unfamiliar, the uncanny valley is this psychological phenomenon. When we look at a cartoon character, our brain knows it's fake, and we accept it.
Right.
When we look at a real human, our brain reads the micro-expressions and recognizes life. But when you create a digital avatar that is like 95% photorealistic, but it lacks those tiny human micro-expressions.
Your brain just rejects it.
Exactly. The brain's threat detection system kicks in. It registers the image as a corpse or something sickly. It induces this immediate visceral feeling of unease.
So you have this heavy device that makes you look deeply unsettling on a Zoom call, and it costs as much as a used car.
Not a great selling point.
No, not at all. But even with all of those physical hurdles, a great salesperson can still sell a vision, right? They can craft a narrative. But the text outlines these impossible human hurdles that Apple engineered for its own staff.
The training process was totally broken.
Yeah. The trainers who went to Cupertino, like Megan Lee, they came back and led 4-hour workshops for the salespeople. But those salespeople on the floor, they only got a 1-hour practice window to actually master the device before they had to demonstrate it to the public.
And think about the mechanics of what that single hour had to cover. I mean, handing someone a new iPhone is easy. You just show them the camera.
Right, anyone can do that.
Yeah. But the Vision Pro requires a highly customized, physically intimate fit. An employee had to use an iPad to physically scan the customer's face. Then they had to navigate this matrix of roughly 25 different sizes of light seals.
25 sizes.
Yeah, 25. These are the fabric cushions that sit between the device and your cheekbones. If the employee chooses the wrong seal, light leaks into the headset, and the immersive optical illusion is completely shattered.
Oh, wow.
The customer just sees a blurry, uncomfortable screen with glare bouncing off the lenses.
And then, assuming the fit is actually perfect, the employee has to teach the customer how to use their eyes and these really subtle finger pinches to navigate an interface they've never seen before. All while reciting a highly choreographed script that was over a dozen screens long.
It's an incredible cognitive load to place on a worker. We have a very telling quote from a longtime salesperson in Chicago, Sam Hernandez.
What did he say?
He detailed his exact preparation schedule. He received a 20-minute demo as a user, got maybe 30 minutes to review this massive multi-page script, practiced fitting the device on exactly one colleague, and was then, in his words, thrown from the nest.
That is wild. And the nest he was thrown into was chaos. Our sources describe the launch environment as a literal madhouse. Apple stores are already high-traffic, high-noise environments.
Yeah, they're not exactly quiet spaces.
Exactly. Picture trying to deliver a delicate, futuristic, guided meditation of a tech demo. You need the customer to focus on subtle virtual cues. But in the background, kids are crying, hundreds of people are shouting, and those heavy wooden display stools are tipping over on the concrete floors, sounding like gunshots.
It was a mess. Employees were visibly stressed. You had curious customers crowding around, staring over the shoulders of the people getting the demos, completely ruining the intimate vibe.
Yeah, totally awkward.
And because of the rushed 1-hour training, employees were making tiny mistakes in fitting those light seals, resulting in those blurry, terrible experiences for the user.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When you combine a massive dozen-page script with only an hour of practice, you aren't prepping salespeople anymore. You're basically sending understudies onto a Broadway stage without a single dress rehearsal, and you're expecting them to carry the entire show.
That's a great way to put it.
But surely Apple, of all companies, knows how to train its retail staff. I mean, they've been doing this for decades. They practically invented modern tech retail.
They did know how. And this is where we have to look backward to understand what went wrong in 2024. The Apple of 2024 was operating on a completely different set of instructions than the Apple of 2001.
Okay, so let's go back to 2001 then. What was the philosophy when Steve Jobs first rolled out these stores?
Well, when Jobs opened the first Apple stores, the broader business world openly mocked him. Oh, yeah. The prevailing wisdom at the time was that you sold computers in cheap, out-of-the-way, big-box stores on the edge of town, stacked high on metal shelves. One former finance chief literally told Businessweek that Jobs was trying to serve caviar in a world that seems pretty content with cheese and crackers.
That is such a 2001 quote. The logic of the era was, why pay a premium for high-end mall real estate when you can just move inventory in an industrial park?
Exactly. But Jobs rejected that logic entirely. He didn't view these locations as stores in the traditional sense. He views them as a church for evangelizing.
The church?
Yeah, he was trying to convert people to a completely new digital lifestyle. In a video tour right before the first store opened in Virginia, Jobs proudly pointed out that literally half the store's square footage was devoted to teaching people, not selling to them.
And the investment in the people was just as lavish as the blonde wood floors and the Ritz-Carlton-inspired Genius Bar. Jobs and his head of retail, Ron Johnson, insisted on generous benefits for store employees, like full health insurance for part-timers.
Which was unheard of in retail.
Right. And they explicitly avoided hiring temporary seasonal workers. The philosophy was incredibly straightforward. If an employee feels like a second-class citizen, they will eventually treat your customers like second-class citizens.
It was an uncompromising vision where human connection was the primary product. Jobs designed the corporate structure so that finance and operations, the bean counters, answered directly to design and product vision.
But then Jobs passed away in 2011, and Tim Cook took the helm. And Tim Cook is fundamentally a brilliant industrial engineer.
And engineers look at systems very differently than visionaries do. They look for bottlenecks. They look for waste.
Right. So Cook brought a radically different mantra to the company. While Jobs famously said, "Don't worry about price," Cook liked to say inventory is fundamentally evil.
Yeah, inventory is evil.
But what does that actually mean for the guy in the blue shirt standing on the store floor? How does inventory is evil change a physical store?
Well, when a CEO believes inventory is evil, you don't keep surplus. You rely on incredibly tight, perfectly timed logistics. If a product is sitting in a back room, it's costing you money to store, and it's losing value every day.
So you just get rid of the back rooms.
Exactly. You shrink the back rooms. Every square foot of a store that doesn't immediately generate revenue is viewed as wasted space. You force just-in-time deliveries, which means employees are constantly scrambling to unload trucks the moment a customer wants a specific device.
Wow.
Cook's genius was in optimization. Over his tenure, he relentlessly shrank costs. He also shifted Apple's revenue stream heavily towards services, things like Apple Music, iCloud, the App Store.
Because subscriptions bring in steady, high-margin cash without the messy physical logistics of moving heavy boxes around the globe.
Exactly. But you cannot apply a rigid supply chain mentality to a human workforce without severe cultural consequences. Our sources detail a slow, painful nickeling and diming of the retail staff through a succession of different retail chiefs.
Yeah, let's talk about those chiefs. Cook first brings in John Browett, a British electronics executive, specifically to trim the fat. Browett looks at the spreadsheets and tries to slash employee hours across the board.
And that went terribly.
It caused such a visceral reaction, what a former HR chief actually called organ rejection by the staff, that Browett lasted less than a year.
And then comes Angela Ahrendts from Burberry, a fashion executive.
Right, which on the surface looks like a return to the premium, high-end vibe. But underneath, the efficiency engine just kept churning. The text notes a huge shift in how workers were prepared under Ahrendts. A longtime employee, Kevin Gallagher, mentioned that when he was hired, he had a 3-week human-led classroom training with a dedicated hiring cohort.
They bonded. They learned the culture together.
Yeah. But under the Ahrendts regime, that was replaced by self-guided computer modules. You sit alone in a back room, click through digital screens for a rec, and then you're cut loose on the floor.
And the final, most aggressive shift comes under Deirdre O'Brien, who pushed the stores even further toward conventional, metric-driven retail. Under the Jobs era, salespeople were largely judged on Net Promoter Scores, which basically asks, did the customer leave happy?
Would they recommend Apple to a friend?
Exactly. It's a qualitative measure of joy. But under O'Brien, the metrics became incredibly rigid and quantitative. How many new phones did you activate today? What was your accessory attach rate?
And the dreaded extended warranty question. One Kansas City employee described the daily reality of this shift. Managers would pull employees aside if their numbers dipped. The store became a place where, as this employee put it, someone asks you 57 times in a transaction, "Do you want Apple Care Plus?"
Which is so frustrating for the customer.
It really is. The entire dynamic of the conversation on the floor shifted from a helpful guide showing you a cool new tool to a predatory salesperson trying to hit a quota. Add to that a shrinking permanent staff and a heavy reliance on those seasonal temps that Steve Jobs had explicitly banned.
It's a complete 180.
So what does this all mean? I have to play devil's advocate here, though. If I'm an Apple executive looking at the stock chart, I am thrilled. The text explicitly says Tim Cook's changes were a stunning financial success. Apple became a multi-trillion-dollar company under this strategy. It's a business, not a charity. As long as the stock price is breaking records, why does it matter if employees have to click through a computer module instead of sitting in a 3-week class?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that executive logic makes perfect sense on a spreadsheet. If you are selling iPhones, a product the public already understands and desperately wants, You can absolutely get away with running your stores like a high-efficiency logistics hub.
Right. They sell themselves at this point.
Exactly. You don't need evangelists to sell an iPhone 15. You just need cashiers. But that logic completely collapses when you introduce a radically new behavioral shift.
Like strapping a computer to your face?
Yes. You cannot squeeze a workforce for over a decade, strip away their autonomy, treat them like a pure operational expense, and then suddenly flip a switch and expect them to deliver a concierge-level magical experience for a highly complex, unproven, futuristic product. The infrastructure of trust and expertise had been hollowed out.
And that brings us to what might be the most tragic casualty of this whole efficiency drive, a specific job title known as the creative.
This is such a fascinating case study in how the culture decayed. Under Steve Jobs, the creative was the ultimate evangelist.
They really were.
Customers could pay $99 a year for a program called One-to-One. If you bought a Mac, you got unlimited hour-long personalized tutorials with a creative. They would teach you how to edit video, how to produce music, how to organize your photos.
Financially, paying a highly trained expert to give a customer unlimited hours of one-on-one coaching for just $99 a year is a terrible margin for the company. It is a massive loss leader.
But culturally, it built fierce, unshakable customer loyalty. It turned ordinary users into lifelong advocates. It proved Apple was an education company at its core.
But then, under the newer regimes looking for efficiency, that program was scrapped. It was replaced by Today at Apple, which were free group sessions out on the open floor. And eventually, these sessions started feeling less like genuine education and more like thinly veiled advertisements.
Yeah, one employee recalled having to teach a 30-minute class solely on how to use the magic keyboard, which basically meant walking people through basic keyboard shortcuts just to convince them to buy a $300 accessory.
Which is just wild. Then the pandemic hits and in-person sessions are suspended entirely. When they finally returned, the whole program was a shadow of its former self. Creatives like Kevin Gallagher and Chaya Barrett at the Towson, Maryland store, who used to teach 6 to 8 personalized deep dive sessions a day, were now doing maybe 1 or 2 group classes.
If that.
Right. And for the rest of their shift, management just pushed them onto the sales floor to push iPhones and Apple Care.
It's basically a bait and switch.
Yeah. It's like signing up to be a teacher because you love education and slowly realizing your principal has turned you into a telemarketer. But look, to push back a little again, retail is retail. If the company needs you to sell and they're paying your hourly wage, shouldn't you just roll up your sleeves and sell iPhones?
Corporate leadership almost certainly viewed it exactly that way, but they failed to account for the psychological contract they had established with these specific workers. Apple heavily recruited, college-educated, highly qualified individuals specifically for these educational roles, promising them a career path distinct from sales.
Oh, I see.
Barrett explicitly stated they took the creative role so they wouldn't have to sell. This bait and switch demoralized the workforce profoundly. They were hired to be teachers, and they were being graded as cashiers.
And that demoralization reached a breaking point. In June of 2022, the employees at that Towson, Maryland store voted to unionize. They became the first unionized Apple location in the United States. And we are just looking at the timeline and the facts here as presented in the text. This unionization was a direct, undeniable response to a workforce feeling overutilized, undervalued, and stripped of the very things that made their jobs meaningful in the first place.
Now bring all this historical context crashing into the Vision Pro launch. Fast forward to early 2024, the headset is launching, and Apple management is locked in a tense, prolonged stalemate with this exact union over a labor contract.
So the atmosphere in the store is already incredibly strained.
Precisely. Management is fighting the union. Morale is at rock bottom, so what does management do? They suspend the few remaining classes taught by these deeply frustrated creatives and pull them out into the middle of the store floor to conduct these incredibly difficult, high-stakes Vision Pro demos.
Wow. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
They took a delicate piece of technology that required absolute finesse and a deft human touch, and they weaponized it in a labor dispute.
Yeah.
They dropped it into a completely fractured environment.
It's worse than sabotaged. To really drive home how much was lost, Scheiber's book compares this 2024 rollout to a launch that happened almost a decade earlier, the Apple Watch in 2015. Because the Apple Watch rollout also started as a bit of a disaster internally, didn't it?
It did, yeah. Internal forecasts for the Apple Watch were slashed by over 70% in its first year. The company initially didn't quite know what the watch was actually for. Was it a high-end fashion accessory? Was it just a notification screen for your wrist?
Right. But the retail employees actually saved it. Back in 2015, the workforce still had enough slack in the system to experiment. Employees could buy the basic version of the Apple Watch for under $200. They bought it, they wore it on their runs, they played with it.
And through their own daily use and through organic conversations with customers who were asking for fitness tools, the staff realized its true potential. They discovered its killer app, health and fitness tracking.
And crucially, the operational structure allowed that insight to travel upwards. During their daily morning meetings, managers would actively solicit qualitative feedback.
Yeah.
They asked the floor staff, what are you seeing out there? What's resonating?
And it worked. The employees bubbled up this insight about fitness tracking. Managers wrote memos to Cupertino. Executives actually listened, pivoted the multi-million-dollar marketing strategy away from high fashion and toward health, and the watch became a colossal success.
Now contrast that organic ground-up rescue operation with the Vision Pro in 2024. The store staffing is so lean that managers literally do not have the operational slack to pull people off the floor to practice the demo.
No time at all.
Furthermore, the device is $3,500. Even with a 25% employee discount, the staff absolutely cannot afford to buy it. They can't take it home, play with it on the weekend, and find that killer app to bubble up to the executives.
And without ownership, there is no enthusiasm. You cannot authentically evangelize a product you don't fully understand and can't afford to bring into your own life.
Yeah, that's just human nature.
Because the employees didn't own the device and barely had time to practice with it, management eventually realized the staff couldn't memorize the massive, complex script. So they simply allowed the employees to stand there and read the script aloud off their iPads.
Just standing over a customer, reciting a script like a robot reading terms of service, it reveals a massive blind spot at the executive level. You can't expect someone to passionately sell a $3,500 device when they're barely making rent.
Totally.
The text notes that managers actually suffered from the delusion that the device would just sell itself based purely on the hardware specs. One manager told a highly skeptical employee, "We know that if we put the thing on someone's face, they're going to have a good experience," and the employee flatly replied, "You're entirely wrong." How could the brilliant minds in Cupertino be so disconnected from the physical reality of their own stores?
This raises an important question, right? Because they had spent over a decade meticulously engineering the human element out of the equation. They spent years standardizing metrics, minimizing backrooms, and treating employees as a logistical expense to be minimized. But when they finally built their most complex, alien, difficult-to-explain product ever, they suddenly discovered they desperately needed that passionate human element back. And they found out the hard way that it simply wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
You cannot conjure a culture of evangelism out of thin air just because you have a new product to sell.
It's a profound miscalculation. To close the loop on the labor unrest at the Tosin store, the text does offer a bit of resolution. In the summer of 2024, the union and Apple finally settled on a contract.
Which is a big deal.
Yeah. It wasn't a massive financial overhaul, about a 10% pay bump distributed over 3 years, but it included critical systemic protections that addressed the root of the decay. They secured a 25% cap on temporary workers and established a formal process to litigate unfair firings. It was a structural step toward restoring a bit of the security and dignity that workers loved about the early days of Apple retail.
But for the Vision Pro, the damage was already done. The final tally is stark. Apple sold fewer than 500,000 Vision Pros in 2024. Compare that 500,000 to the roughly 10 million Apple Watches they sold in their first year, or the 200 million iPhones they move annually.
Wow.
The headset certainly had hardware flaws. But the true failure was in fundamentally misunderstanding that a complex technological bridge requires a strong human foundation to hold it up.
Yeah. Whether you are managing a team of 5, launching a multi-million-dollar product, or just walking into a big box store as a customer, this deep dive highlights a universal truth. You cannot relentlessly optimize the humanity out of a system and then expect it to deliver magic on command.
Which leaves us with this final thought to consider. As we move deeper into an era where companies across all industries are relentlessly obsessed with AI, with automation, and with squeezing every ounce of efficiency out of their systems, are we quietly destroying the very human infrastructure we need to actually convince everyday people to adopt these new technologies in the first place?
You can hide a new product behind non-disclosure agreements and Faraday bags, but you can never hide a fractured workforce from your customers.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.